Are you okay, Vella? Why were you on the floor? Are you okay? Okay. I'm gonna jump down to the live stream channel because I'm live now. Okay. Sorry about that. Apparently Vella just hit the floor, as you guys heard, because I was live on the mic when I was talking to her in Discord. Anyway, yeah, so welcome. It's, yep, all your fault. Anyway, wherever you are, whatever time it is, it's obviously bedtime. Of course, I'm obvious. A little scattered, a little off, not quite all here. But I'm still here with you guys. Got my tea, got the book, ready to share with you guys. Yeah. Let me put out the other posts. All right, good enough. Good enough. So, last time we started reading Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Tale of a Highlander who's not trying to cut everyone's heads off with a sword. Well, not everyone, but all the other immortals. And with not quite as good a soundtrack. Ow, that's hot, that's hot, that's hot. Ow, 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 teapot hot. Ow. Okay. Wow, that was like way hotter than normal. Who knew that reading books could be so hazardous? Hey, Random. I'm glad you're here. I haven't seen you in a while. At least not in chat. Yes, tea and teapots do get that way. I know. Well, I'm glad you're here on your day off. It's amazing. Sorry if I seem a little off. I've been dealing with some stuff. I got contacted by my kid's school. And it turns out that in violation of the orders from the court and everything, and you know, all normal sensibilities from being a parent, her mother has not paid any of her tuition in 2 years. And it's racked up quite a debt. Like 5,500 US, and she doesn't get to go back next term unless it gets paid. And I am appalled. Hey, Zhivago. Now, there are other schools that don't charge a bunch of money around, which would be fine. Not great, but livable, if not for one little problem. She has really screwed up this year. Partly due to the pandemic and being remote and all that, and that being more of a challenge. But she's failed a lot of her classes, and the regular schools, in addition to not actually challenging her or providing the education she needs, they don't let you get rid of that. Like, that would be on her record permanently and would cut off a significant portion of her dreams and ambitions. Now, if she stays at the school she's at, if I can get this debt paid somehow, then they have a very generous policy where you can retake the class and expunge the old grades. And so she could completely recover as though she'd never made the mistake in the first place. And she could, learn the lesson, grow, and move on. Apparently the school didn't do anything in terms of collections or whatever, because if they had, their policy would have expelled my kid, and they wanted her to still be able to go there. So I've been super stressed. And then I have another thing where anyway, been getting no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to go ahead and read the story, and we'll dive into that. Get away from the badness. And read about villains in a book that get dealt with and have their comeuppance. And yeah. All the books. Where the world eventually makes sense. And, people of noble intent triumph. Evil loses. Things work out all right in the end. Where you can always find your way home. Yeah. So, books. Books are wonderful for that. All right. We were reading Kidnap by Robert Louis Stevenson, and our young protagonist had lost his father. His mother had died some years before, and he was directed to go to the home of Balfour of the Shaws, and met his uncle, who was pretty sus. Unfortunately, I don't think he was an imposter. I think his uncle was just shitty, and tried to set him up to take a terrible fall and die in an incomplete tower in the darkness. We suspect it's because he was the rightful heir, and his uncle thought he was going to take the property away. And so, rather than, welcome him as his remaining family, he attempted to off him. Hey, Sparky, welcome. Yep, I'm just summing up the reading before we jump into it. So, yes, pretty good timing. You missed out on all my morose muttering, so perfect. So this is chapter 5. Yes, he is very much a pooty head. I go to the Queen's Ferry. Much rain fell in the night, and the next morning there blew a bitter, wintry wind out of the northwest, driving scattered clouds. For all that, and before the sun began to peep, or the last of the stars had vanished, I made my way to the side of the burn, which in this case means stream, and I had a plunge in a deep, whirling pool. All aglow from my bath, I sat down once more beside the fire, which I replenished, and began gravely to consider my position. It is a good word for a bad thing. And morose mutterings has the repeated sound going for it. There was now no doubt about my uncle's enmity. There was no doubt I carried my life in my hand, and he would leave no stone unturned that he might compass my destruction. But I was young and spirited, and like most lads that had been country bred, I had a great opinion of my shrewdness. I had come to his door no better than a beggar, and little more than a child. He had met me with treachery and violence. Sorry, taking the headset off. It's giving me a headache. It would be a fine consummation to take the upper hand and drive him like a herd of sheep. I sat there, nursing my knee and smiling at the fire, and I saw myself in fancy smell out his secrets one after another, and grow to be that man's king and ruler. The warlock of Essendine, they say, had made a mirror in which men could read the future. It must have been of other stuff than burning coal, for in all the shapes and pictures that I sat and gazed at, there was never a ship, never a seaman with a hairy cap, never a big bludgeon for my silly head, or the least sign of all those tribulations that were ripe to fall on me. Presently, all swollen with conceit, I went upstairs and gave my prisoner his liberty. He gave me good morning civilly, and I gave the same to him, smiling down upon him from the heights of my sufficiency. Soon we were set to breakfast, as it might have been the day before. "Well, sir," said I, with a jeering tone, "have you nothing more to say to me?" And then, as he made no articulate reply, "It will be time, I think, to understand each other," I continued. "You took me for a country Johnny Raw, with no more mother wit or courage than a porridge stick. I took you for a good man, or no worse than others at the least. It seems we were both wrong. What cause you have to fear me, to cheat me, and to attempt my life?" He murmured something about a jest, and that he liked a bit of fun, and then, seeing me smile, changed his tone, and assured me he would make all clear as soon as we had breakfasted. I saw by his face that he had no lie ready for me, though he was hard at work preparing one, and I think I was about to tell him so, when we were interrupted by a knocking at the door. Bidding my uncle sit where he was, I went to open it, and found on the doorstep a half-grown boy in sea clothes. He had no sooner seen me than he began to dance some steps of the sea hornpipe, which I had never before heard of, far less seen, snapping his fingers in the air and footing it right cleverly. For all that, he was blue with the cold, and there was something in his face, a look between tears and laughter, that was highly pathetic and consisted ill with this gaiety of manner. "What cheer, mate?" says he, with a cracked voice. I asked him soberly to name his pleasure. "Oh, pleasure," says he, and then began to sing, "For it's my delight of a shiny night in the season of the year." "Well," said I, "if you have no pleasure at all, I will even be so unmannerly as to shut you out." "Stay, brother," he cried. "Have you no fun about you? Or do you want to get me thrashed? I brought a letter from old Heezy Ozy to Mr. Bellflower." He showed me a letter as he spoke. "And I say, mate," he added, "I'm mortal hungry." "Well," said I, "come into the house, and you shall have a bite if I go empty for it." With that I brought him in, and set him down to my own place, where he fell to greedily on the remains of breakfast, winking to me between whiles, and making many faces, which I think the poor soul considered manly. Meanwhile my uncle had read the letter, and sat thinking. Then suddenly he got to his feet with a great air of liveliness, and pulled me apart into the farthest corner of the room. "Read that," said he, and put the letter in my hand. Here it is, lying before me as I write. "The Hawes Inn at the Queen's Ferry. Sir, I lie here with my hawser up and down, and send my cabin boy to inform. If you have any further commands for overseas, today will be the last occasion, as the wind will serve us well out of the Firth. I will not seek to deny that I have had crosses with your doer, Mr. Rankhiller, of which, if not speedily read up, you may look to see some losses follow. I have drawn a bill upon you, as per margin, and am, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Elias Hosian." "You see, Davy," resumed my uncle, as soon as he saw that I had done, "I have a venture with this man Hosian, the captain of a trading brig, the Covenant of Dysart. Now if you and me was to walk over with yon lad, I could see the captain at the Hawes, or maybe on board the Covenant, if there was papers to be signed. And so far from a loss of time, we can jog on to the lawyer, Mr. Rankhiller's. After that's come and gone, you would be swear to believe me upon my naked word, but you'll believe Rankhiller. He's factor to half the gentry in these parts, an old man forby, highly respected, and he kenned your father. I stood a while and thought. I was going to some place of shipping, which was doubtless populous, and where my uncle durst attempt no violence. And indeed, even the society of the cabin boy so far protected me. Once there, I believed I could force on the visit to the lawyer, even if my uncle were now insincere in proposing it. And perhaps, in the bottom of my heart, I wished a nearer view of the sea and ships. You are to remember I had lived all my life in the inland hills, and just 2 days before had had my first sight of the Firth, lying like a blue floor, and the sailed ships moving on the face of it, no bigger than toys. One thing with another, I made up my mind. Very well, says I. Let us go to the ferry. My uncle got into his hat and coat, and buckled an old rusty cutlass on, and then we trod the fire out, locked the door, and set forth upon our walk. The wind, being in that cold quarter, the northwest, blew nearly in our faces as we went. It was the month of June. The grass was all white with daisies, and the trees with blossom. But, to judge by our blue nails and aching wrists, the time might have been winter, and the whiteness a December frost. Uncle Ebenezer trudged in the ditch, jogging from side to side like an old plowman coming home from work. He never said a word the whole way, and I was thrown for a talk on the cabin boy. He told me his name was Ransom, and that he had followed the sea since he was 9, but could not say how old he was, as he had lost his reckoning. He showed me tattoo marks, bearing his breast in the teeth of the wind, and in spite of my remonstrances, for I thought it was enough to kill him. He swore horribly whenever he remembered, but more like a silly schoolboy than a man, and boasted of many wild and bad things that he had done, stealthy thefts, false accusations, aye, even murder, but all with such a dearth of likelihood in the details, and such a weak and crazy swagger in the delivery, as disposed me rather to pity than to believe him. I asked him of the brig, which he declared was the finest ship that sailed, and of Captain Hosian, in whose praises he was equally loud. Easy-Ozy, for so he still named the skipper, was a man by his account that minded for nothing either in heaven or earth, one that, as people said, would crack on all sail into the day of judgment, rough, fierce, unscrupulous, and brutal, and all this my poor cabin boy had taught himself to admire as something seamanlike and manly. He would only admit one flaw in his idol. He ain't no seaman, he admitted. That's Mr. Shawn that navigates the brig. He's the finest seaman in the trade, only for drink, and I tell you I believe it. Why, look here, and turning down his stocking, he showed me a great raw red wound that made my blood run cold. He done that. Mr. Shawn done it, he said, with an air of pride. What? I cried. Do you take such savage usage at his hands? Why, you are no slave to be so handled. No, said the poor mooncalf, changing his tone at once. And so he'll find. See here, and he showed me a great case knife, which he told me was stolen. Oh, says he, let me see him try. I dare him to. I'll do for him. Oh, he ain't the first. And he confirmed it with a poor, silly, ugly oath. I have never felt such pity for anyone in this wide world as I have felt for that half-witted creature, and it began to come over me that the brig Covenant, for all her pious name, was little better than a hell upon the seas. 12-year-old humor here. Yeah. Have you no friends, said I. He said he had a father in some English seaport. I forget which. He was a fine man, too, he said, but he's dead. In heaven's name, cried I, can you find no reputable life on shore? Oh, no, says he, winking and looking very sly. They would put me to a trade. I know a trick worth 2 of that, I do. I asked him what trade could be so dreadful as the one he followed, where he ran the continual peril of his life, not alone from wind and sea, but by the horrid cruelty of those who were his masters. He said it was very true, and then began to praise the life, and tell what a pleasure it was to get on shore with money in his pocket, and spend it like a man, and buy apples, and swagger, and surprise what he called stick-in-the-mud boys. And then it's not all as bad as that, says he. There's worse off than me. There's the 20-pounders. Oh, laws, you should see them taken on. Why, I've seen a man as old as you, I dare say. To him, I seemed old. Ah, and he had a beard, too. Well, and as soon as we cleared out of the river, and he had the drug out of his head, my, how he cried and carried on. I made a fine fool of him, I tell you. And then there's little uns, too. Oh, little by me. I tell you, I keep them in order. When we carry little uns, I have a rope's end of my own to wallop 'em. And so he ran on, until it came in on me that what he meant by 20-pounders were those unhappy criminals who were sent overseas to slavery in North America, or the still more unhappy innocents who were kidnapped or trepanned, as the word went, for private interests or vengeance. Just then we came to the top of the hill, and looked down on the ferry and the Hope. The Firth of Forth, as is very well known, narrows at this point to the width of a good-sized river, which makes a convenient ferry going north, and turns the upper reach into a landlocked haven for all manner of ships. Right in the midst of the narrows lies an islet with some ruins. On the south shore they have built a pier for the service of the ferry, and at the end of the pier, on the other side of the road, and backed against a pretty garden of holly trees and hawthorns, I could see the building which they called the Hawes Inn. The town of Queensferry lies farther west, and the neighborhood of the inn looked pretty lonely at that time of day, for the boat had just gone north with passengers. A skiff, however, lay beside the pier, with some seamen sleeping on the thwarts. This, as Ransom told me, was the brig's boat waiting for the captain, and about half a mile off, and all alone in the anchorage, he showed me the Covenant herself. There was a sea-going bustle on board. Yards were swinging into place, and as the wind blew from that quarter, I could hear the song of the sailors as they pulled upon the ropes. After all I had listened to upon the way, I looked at that ship with an extreme abhorrence, and from the bottom of my heart I pitied all poor souls that were condemned to sail in her. We had all three pulled up on the brow of the hill, and now I marched across the road and addressed my uncle. I think it right to tell you, sir, says I, there's nothing that will bring me on board that Covenant. He seemed awakened from a dream. Eh, he said, what's that? I told him over again. Well, well, he said, we'll have to please ye, I suppose. But what are we standing here for? It's perishing cold, and if I'm no mistaken, they're busking the Covenant for sea. Chapter 6. What Befell at the Queen's Ferry. As soon as we came to the inn, Ransom led us up the stair to a small room with a bed in it, and heated like an oven by a great fire of coal. At a table hard by the chimney, a tall, dark, sober-looking man sat writing. In spite of the heat of the room, he wore a thick sea jacket, buttoned to the neck, and a tall, hairy cap drawn down over his ears. Yet I never saw any man, not even a judge upon the bench, look cooler or more studious and self-possessed than this ship captain. He got to his feet at once, and coming forward, offered his large hand to Ebenezer. I am proud to see you, Mr. Balfour, said he, in a fine, deep voice, and glad that ye are here in time. The wind's fair, and the tide upon the turn. We'll see the old coal-bucket burning on the Isle of May before tonight. Captain Hosian, returned my uncle, you keep your room unco hot. It's a habit I have, Mr. Balfour, said the skipper. I'm a cold rife man by my nature. I've a cold blood, sir. There's neither fur nor flannel, no, sir, nor hot rum will warm up what they call the temperatures. Sir, it's the same with most men that have been carbonadoed, as they call it, in the tropic seas. Well, well, Captain, replied my uncle, we must all be the way we're made. But it chanced that this fancy of the captain's had a great share in my misfortunes, for though I had promised myself not to let my kinsman out of sight, I was both so impatient for a nearer look of the sea, and so sickened by the closeness of the room, that when he told me to run downstairs and play myself a while, I was fool enough to take him at his word. As I went, therefore, leaving the two men sitting down to a bottle and a great mass of papers, and crossing the road in front of the inn, walked down upon the beach. With the wind in that quarter, only little wavelets, not much bigger than I had seen upon a lake, beat upon the shore. But the weeds were new to me, some green, some brown and long, and some with little bladders that crackled between my fingers. Even so far up the Firth, The smell of the sea-water was exceedingly salt and stirring. The Covenant, besides, was beginning to shake out her sails, which hung upon the yards in clusters, and the spirit of all that I beheld put me in thoughts of far voyages and foreign places. I looked, too, at the seamen with the skiff, big brown fellows, some in shirts, some with jackets, some with colored handkerchiefs about their throats, one with a brace of pistols stuck into his pockets, 2 or 3 with knotty bludgeons, and all with their case knives. I passed the time of day with one that looked less desperate than his fellows, and asked him of sailing on the brig. He said they would get under way as soon as the ebb set, and expressed his gladness to be out of a port where there were no taverns and fiddlers, but all with such horrifying oaths that I made haste to get away from him. This threw me back on Ransom, who seemed the least wicked of that gang, and who soon came out of the inn and ran to me, crying for a bowl of punch. I told him I would give him no such thing, for neither he nor I was of an age for such indulgences. But a glass of ale you may have, and welcome, said I. He mopped and mowed at me and called me names, but he was glad to get the ale for all that, and presently we were set down at a table in the front room of the inn, and both eating and drinking with a good appetite. Here it occurred to me that, as the landlord was a man of that country, I might do well to make a friend of him. I offered him a share, as was much the custom in those days, but he was far too great a man to sit with such poor customers as Ransom and myself, and he was leaving the room when I called him back to ask if he knew Mr. Rankeller. Hoot, aye, says he, and a very honest man. And oh, by the by, says he, was it you that came in with Ebenezer? And when I had told him yes, you'll be no friend of his, he asked, meaning, in the Scottish way, that I would be no relative. I told him no, none. I thought not, said he, and yet you have a kind of glyph of Mr. Alexander. I said it seemed that Ebenezer was ill seen in the country. Nae doubt, said the landlord. He's a wicked old man, and there's many would like to see him grinning in the toe. Grinning in the rope. So, hanging, I guess. Janet Clouston and Mortimer that is harried out of house and hame, and yet he is once a fine young fellow, too. But that was before the saw get abroad about Mr. Alexander. That was like the death of him. And what was it, I asked. Oh, just that he had killed him, said the landlord. Did you never hear that? And what would he kill him for, said I. And what for, but just to get the place, said he. The place, said I. The Shaws. Nay, the place that I ken, said he. Ay, man, said I, is that so? Was Alexander the eldest son? Deed was he, said the landlord. What else would he have killed him for? And with that he went away, as he had been impatient to do from the beginning. Of course, I had guessed it a long while ago, but it is one thing to guess, another to know, and I sat stunned with my good fortune, and could scarcely grow to believe that the same poor lad who had trudged in the dust from Ettrick Forest not 2 days ago was now one of the rich of the earth, and had a house and broad lands, and if he but knew how to ride, might mount his horse tomorrow. All these pleasant things, and 1,000 others, crowded into my mind, as I sat staring before me out of the inn window, and paying no heed to what I saw. Only I remember that my eye lighted on Captain Hosian down on the pier among his seamen, and speaking with some authority. And presently he came marching back toward the house, with no mark of a sailor's clumsiness, but carrying his fine, tall figure with a manly bearing, and still with the same sober, grave expression on his face. I wondered if it was possible that Ransom's stories could be true, and half disbelieved them. They fitted so ill with the man's looks. But indeed he was neither so good as I supposed him, nor quite so bad as Ransom did. For in fact he was 2 men, and left the better one behind as soon as he set foot on board his vessel. The next thing I heard my uncle calling me, and found the pair in the road together. It was the captain who addressed me, and that with an air very flattering to a young lad of grave equality. Sir, said he, Mr. Balfour tells me great things of you, and for my own part I like your looks. I wish I was for longer here, that we might make the better friends, but we'll make the most of what we have. You shall come on board my brig for half an hour, till the ebb sets, and drink a bowl with me. Now, I longed to see the inside of a ship more than words can tell. But I was not going to put myself in jeopardy, and I told him my uncle and I had an appointment with a lawyer. Aye, said he. He passed me word of that. But you see, the boat'll set you ashore at the town pier, and that's but a penny stone cast from Rankeller's house. And here he suddenly leaned down and whispered in my ear, "Take care of the old Todd. He means mischief. Come aboard till I can get a word with you." And then, passing his arm through mine, he continued aloud as he set off towards his boat. "But come, what can I bring you from the Carolinas? Any friend of Mr. Balfour's can command. A roll of tobacco, Indian featherwork, a skin of a wild beast, a stone pipe, the mockingbird that mews for all the world like a cat, the cardinal bird that is red as blood. Take your pick and say your pleasure." By this time we were at the boat side, and he was handing me in. I did not dream of hanging back. I thought, the poor fool, that I had found a good friend and helper, and I was rejoiced to see the ship. As soon as we were all set in our places, the boat was thrust off from the pier and began to move over the waters. And what with my pleasure in this new movement, and my surprise at our low position, and the appearance of the shores, and the growing bigness of the brig as we drew near to it, I could hardly understand what the captain said, and must have answered him at random. As soon as we were alongside, where I sat fairly gaping at the ship's height, the strong humming of the tide against its sides, and the pleasant cries of the seamen at their work, Hosian, declaring that he and I must be the first aboard, ordered a tackle to be sent down from the main yard. In this, I was whipped into the air and sat down again on the deck, where the captain stood ready waiting for me, and instantly slipped back his arm under mine. There I stood some while, a little dizzy with the unsteadiness of all around me, perhaps a little afraid, and yet vastly pleased with these strange sights. The captain, meanwhile, pointing out the strangest, and telling me their names and uses. "But where is my uncle?" said I, suddenly. "Aye," said Hosian, with a sudden grimness. "That's the point." I felt I was lost. With all my strength I plucked myself clear of him and ran to the bulwarks. Sure enough, there was the boat pulling for the town, with my uncle sitting in the stern. I gave a piercing cry, "Help! Help! Murder!" so that both sides of the anchorage rang with it, and my uncle turned round where he was sitting, and showed me a face full of cruelty and terror. It was the last I saw. Already strong hands had been plucking me back from the ship's side, and now a thunderbolt seemed to strike me. I saw a great flash of fire, and fell senseless. Chapter 7. I go to sea in the brig Covenant of Dysart. I came to myself in darkness, in great pain, bound hand and foot, and deafened by many unfamiliar noises. There sounded in my ears a roaring of water, as of a huge mill dam, the thrashing of heavy sprays, the thundering of the sails, and the shrill cries of seamen. The whole world now heaved giddily up, and now rushed giddily downward, and so sick and hurt was I in body, and my mind so much confounded, that it took me a long while, chasing my thoughts up and down, and ever stunned again by a fresh stab of pain, to realize that I must be lying somewhere, bound in the belly of that unlucky ship, and that the wind must have strengthened to a gale. With the clear perception of my plight, there fell upon me a blackness of despair, a horror or remorse at my own folly, and a passion of anger at my uncle, that once more bereft me of my senses. When I returned again to life, the same uproar, the same confused and violent movements, shook and deafened me, and presently, to my other pains and distresses, there was added the sickness of an unused landsman on the sea. In the time of my adventurous youth, I suffered many hardships, but none that was so crushing to my mind and body, or lit by so few hopes, as these first hours aboard the brig. I heard a gunfire, and supposed the storm had proved too strong for us, and we were firing signals of distress. The thought of deliverance, even by death in the deep sea, was welcome to me. Yet it was no such matter, but, as I was afterwards told, a common habit of the captain's, which I here set down to show that even the worst man may have his kindlier side. We were then passing, it appeared, within some miles of Dysart, where the brig was built, and where old Mrs. Hosian, the captain's mother, had come some years before to live. And whether outward or inward bound, the Covenant was never suffered to go by that place by day without a gun fired and colors shown. I had no measure of time. Day and night were alike in that ill-smelling cavern of the ship's bowels where I lay, and the misery of my situation drew out the hours to double. How long, therefore, I lay waiting to hear the ship split upon some rock, or to feel her reel head foremost into the depths of the sea, I have not the means of computation. But sleep at length stole from me the consciousness of sorrow. I was awakened by the light of a hand lantern shining in my face. A small man of about 30, with green eyes and a tangle of fair hair, stood looking down at me. "Well," said he, "how goes it?" I answered by a sob, and my visitor then felt my pulse and temples, and set himself to wash and dress the wound upon my scalp. "Aye," said he, "a sore dunt. What, man, cheer up. The world's no done. You've made a bad start of it, but you'll make a better. Have you had any meat?" I said I could not look at it, and thereupon he gave me some brandy and water in a tin pannikin, and left me once more to myself. The next time he came to see me, I was lying betwixt sleep and waking, my eyes wide open in the darkness, the sickness quite departed, but succeeded by a horrid giddiness and swimming that was almost worse to bear. I ached besides in every limb, and the cords that bound me seemed to be afire. The smell of the hole in which I lay seemed to have become a part of me, and during the long interval since his last visit I had suffered tortures of fear, now from the scurrying of the ship's rats that sometimes pattered on my very face, and now from the dismal imaginings that haunt the bed of fever. The glimmer of the lantern, as a trap opened, shone in like the heaven sunlight, and though it only showed me the strong, dark beams of the ship that was my prison, I could have cried aloud for gladness. The man with the green eyes was the first to descend the ladder, and I noticed that he came somewhat unsteadily. He was followed by the captain. Neither said a word, but the first set to and examined me, and dressed my wound as before, while Hosian looked me in my face with an odd, black look. "Now, sir, you see for yourself," said the first. "A high fever, no appetite, no light, no meat. You see for yourself what that means." "I am no conjurer, Mr. Rioch," said the captain. "Give me leave, sir," said Rioch. "You've a good head upon your shoulders, and a good Scotch tongue to ask with, but I will leave you no manner of excuse. I want that boy taken out of this hole, and put in the forecastle." "What you may want, sir, is a matter of concern to nobody but yourself," returned the captain, "but I can tell you that which is to be. Here he is, here he shall bide." "Admitting that you have been paid in a proportion," said the other, "I will crave leave humbly to say that I have not. Paid I am, and none too much, to be the second officer of this old tub, and you ken very well if I do my best to earn it. But I was paid for nothing more." "If you could hold back your hand from the tin pan, Mr. Rioch, I would have no complaint to make of you," returned the skipper, "and instead of asking riddles, I make bold to say that you would keep your breath to cool your porridge. Will be required on deck," he added, in a sharper note, and set one foot upon the ladder. But Mr. Rioch caught him by the sleeve. "Admitting that you have been paid to do a murder," he began. Hosian turned upon him in a flash. "What's that?" he cried. "What kind of talk is that?" "It seems it is the talk that you can understand," said Mr. Rioch, looking him steadily in the face. "Mr. Rioch, I have sailed with ye 3 cruises," replied the captain. "In all that time, sir, you should have learned to know me. I'm a stiff man and a dour man, but for what you say the now, fie, it comes from a bad heart and a black conscience. If you say the lad will die—" "Aye, will he?" said Mr. Rioch. "Well, sir, is not that enough?" said Hosian. "Flit him where you please." "Hey, Vela, could you get rid of the big follows, dude? Apparently they came back. Pretty please." Thereupon the captain ascended the ladder, and I, who had lain silent throughout this strange conversation, beheld Mr. Rioch turn after him and bow as low as to his knees in what was plainly a spirit of derision. Even in my then state of sickness, I perceived two things: that the mate was touched with liquor, as the captain hinted, and that drunk or sober, he was like to prove a valuable friend. Thank you, Vela, you're amazing. 5 minutes afterward, my bonds were cut. I was hoisted on a man's back, carried up the forecastle, and laid in a bunk on some sea blankets, where the first thing that I did was to lose my senses. It was a blessed thing indeed to open my eyes again upon the daylight, and to find myself in the society of men. The forecastle was a roomy place enough, set all about with berths, in which the men of the watch below were seated smoking, or lying down asleep. The day being calm, and the wind fair, the scuttle was open, and not only the good daylight, but from time to time, as the ship rolled, a dusty beam of sunlight shone in, and dazzled and delighted me. I had no sooner moved, moreover, than one of the men brought me a drink of something healing which Mr. Riach had prepared, and bade me lie still, and I should soon be well again. There were no bones broken, he explained. A clow on the head was naething, man, said he. It was me that gave it you. Here, I lay for the space of many days, a close prisoner, and not only got my health again, but came to know my companions. They were a rough lot indeed, as sailors mostly are, being men rooted out of all the kindly parts of life, and condemned to toss together on the rough seas with masters no less cruel. There were some among them that had sailed with the pirates, and seen things it would be a shame even to speak of. Some were men that had run from the king's ships, and went with a halter round their necks, of which they made no secret, and all, as the saying goes, were at a word and a blow with their best friends. Yet I had not been many days shut up with them before I began to be ashamed of my first judgment, when I had drawn away from them at the ferry pier, as though they had been unclean beasts. No class of man is altogether bad, but each has its own faults and virtues, and these shipmates of mine were no exception to the rule. Rough they were, sure enough, and bad, I suppose, but they had many virtues. They were kind when it occurred to them, simple even beyond the simplicity of a country lad like me, and had some glimmerings of honesty. There was one man, of maybe 40, that would sit on my berthside for hours, and tell me of his wife and child. He was a fisher that had lost his boat, and thus been driven to the deep sea voyaging. Well, it is years ago now, but I have never forgotten him. His wife, who was young by him, as he often told me, waited in vain to see her man return. He would never again make the fire for her in the morning, nor yet keep the barn when she was sick. Indeed, many of these poor fellows, as the event proved, were upon their last cruise. The deep seas and cannibal fish received them, and it is a thankless business to speak ill of the dead. Among other good deeds that they did, they returned my money, which had been shared among them, and though it was about a third short, I was very glad to get it, and hoped great good from it in the land I was going to. The ship was bound for the Carolinas, and you must not suppose that I was going to that place merely as an exile. The trade was even then much depressed, since that, and with the rebellion of the colonies and the formation of the United States, it has, of course, come to an end. But in those days of my youth, white men were still sold into slavery on the plantations, and that was the destiny to which my wicked uncle had condemned me. The cabin boy Ransom, from whom I had first heard of these atrocities, came in at times from the Roundhouse, where he berthed and served, now nursing a bruised limb in silent agony, now raving against the cruelty of Mr. Shawn. It made my heart bleed, but the men had a great respect for the chief mate, who was, as they said, the only seaman of the whole jing-bang, and none such a bad man when he was sober. Indeed, I found there was a strange peculiarity about our two mates. The Mr. Riach was sullen, unkind, and harsh when he was sober, and Mr. Shawn would not hurt a fly except when he was drinking. I asked about the captain, but I was told drink made no difference upon that man of iron. I did my best in the small time allowed me to make something like a man, or rather I should say something like a boy of the poor creature, Ransom, but his mind was scarce truly human. He could remember nothing of the time before he came to sea, only that his father had made clocks, and had a starling in the parlor, which could whistle the north country, All else had been blotted out in these years of hardship and cruelties. He had a strange notion of the dry land, picked up from sailors' stories, that it was a place where lads were put into some kind of slavery called a trade, and where apprentices were continuously lashed and clapped into foul prisons. In a town, he thought every second person a decoy, and every third house a place in which seamen would be drugged and murdered. To be sure, I would tell him how kindly I had myself been used upon that dry land he was so much afraid of, and how well fed and carefully taught, both by my friends and my parents, and that if he had been recently hurt, he would weep bitterly and swear to run away. But if he was in his usual crack-brain humor, or still more, if he had had a glass of spirits in the Roundhouse, he would deride the notion. It was Mr. Riach, heaven forgive him, who gave the boy drink, and it was, doubtless, kindly meant. But besides that, it was a ruin to his health. It was the pitifullest thing in life to see this unhappy, unfriended creature staggering and dancing and talking he knew not what. Some of the men laughed, but not all. Others would grow as black as thunder, thinking perhaps of their own childhood or their own children, and bid him stop that nonsense and think what he was doing. As for me, I felt ashamed to look at him, and the poor child still comes about me in my dreams. All this time, you should know, the Covenant was meeting continual headwinds and tumbling up and down against head seas, so that the scuttle was almost constantly shut, and the forecastle lighted only by a swinging lantern on a beam. There was constant labor for all hands. The sails had to be made and shortened every hour. The strain told on the men's temper. There was a growl of quarreling all day long from berth to berth, and as I was never allowed to set my foot on deck, you can picture to yourselves how weary of my life I grew to be, and how impatient for a change. And a change I was to get, as you shall hear. But I must first tell of a conversation I had with Mr. Riach, which put a little heart in me to bear my troubles, getting him in a favorable stage of drink, for indeed he never looked near me when he was sober. I pledged him to secrecy, and told him my whole story. He declared it was like a ballad, that he would do his best to help me, that I should have paper, pen, and ink, and write one line to Mr. Campbell, and another to Mr. Rankiller, and that if I had told the truth, 10 to 1 he would be able, with their help, to pull me through and set me in my rights. And in the meantime, says he, keep your heart up. You're not the only one, I'll tell you that. There's many a man hoeing tobacco overseas that should be mounting his horse at his own door at home. Many and many, and life is all a verorium at the best. Look at me. I'm a lard's son, and more than half a doctor, and here I am, ban-jacked to Hosian. I thought it would be civil to ask him for his story. He whistled loud. Never had one, said he. I liked fun, that's all. And he skipped out of the forecastle. Chapter 8. The Roundhouse. One night, about 12 o'clock, a man of Mr. Riach's watch, which was on deck, came below for his jacket, and instantly there began to go a whisper about the forecastle that Sean has done for him at last. There was no need of a name. We all knew who was meant. But we had scarce time to get the idea rightly in our heads, far less to speak of it, when the scuttle was again flung open, and Captain Hosian came down the ladder. He looked sharply round the bunks in the tossing light of the lantern, and then, walking straight up to me, he addressed me, to my surprise, in tones of kindness. "My man," said he, "we want you to serve in the Roundhouse. You and Ransom are to change berths. Run away aft with you." Even as he spoke, 2 seamen appeared in the scuttle, carrying Ransom in their arms, and the ship at that moment giving a great sheer into the sea, and the lantern swinging, the light fell direct on the boy's face. It was as white as wax, and had a look upon it like a dreadful smile. The blood in me ran cold, and I drew in my breath as if I had been struck. Run away aft with you," cried Hosian. And at that I brushed by the sailors and the boy, who neither spoke nor moved, and ran up the ladder on deck. The brig was sheering swiftly and giddily through a long, cresting swell. She was on the starboard tack, and on the left hand, under the arched foot of the foresail, I could see the sunset still quite bright. This, at such an hour of the night, surprised me greatly, but I was too ignorant to draw the true conclusion, that we were going north about round Scotland, and were now on the high sea between the Orkney and Shetland Islands, having avoided the dangerous currents of the Pentland Firth. For my part, who had been so long shut in the dark and knew nothing of headwinds, I thought we might be halfway or more across the Atlantic. And indeed, beyond that I wondered a little at the lateness of the sunset light, I gave no heed to it, and pushed on across the decks, running between the seas, catching at ropes, and only saved from going overboard by one of the hands on deck who had always been kind to me. The Roundhouse, for which I was bound, and where I was now to sleep and serve, stood some 6 feet above the decks, and considering the size of the brig, was of good dimensions. Inside were a fixed table and bench, and 2 berths, one for the captain, and the other for the 2 mates, turn and turn about. It was all fitted with lockers from top to bottom, so as to stow away the officers' belongings, and a part of the ship's stores. There was a second storeroom underneath, which you entered by a hatchway in the middle of the deck. Indeed, all the best of the meat and drink, and the whole of the powder were collected in this place, and all the firearms, except the 2 pieces of brass ordnance, were set in a rack in the aftermost wall of the roundhouse. The most of the cutlasses were in another place. A small window with a shutter on each side and a skylight in the roof gave it light by day. And in the dark, after dark, there was a lamp always burning. It was burning when I entered, not brightly, but enough to show Mr. Shawn sitting at the table, with the brandy bottle and a tin pannikin in front of him. He was a tall man, strongly made and very black, and he stared before him on the table like one stupid. He took no notice of my coming in, nor did he move when the captain followed, and leant on the berth beside me, looking darkly at the mate. I stood in great fear of Hosian, and had my reasons for it, but something told me I need not be afraid of him just then, and I whispered in his ear, "How is he?" He shook his head like one that does not know, and does not wish to think, and his face was very stern. Presently Mr. Riach came in. He gave the captain a glance that meant the boy was dead as plain as speaking, and took his place like the rest of us, so that we all 3 stood without a word, staring down at Mr. Shawn, and Mr. Shawn on his side sat without a word, looking hard upon the table. All of a sudden he put out his hand to take the bottle, and at that Mr. Riach started forward and carried it away from him, rather by surprise than violence, crying out with an oath that there had been too much of this work altogether, and that a judgment would fall upon the ship. And as he spoke, the weather sliding doors standing open, he tossed the bottle into the sea. Mr. Shawn was on his feet in a trice. He still looked dazed, but he meant murder, aye, and would have done it for the second time that night, had not the captain stepped in between him and his victim. "Sit down," roars the captain. "You sot swine, do you know what you've done? You've murdered the boy." Mr. Shawn seemed to understand, for he sat down again and put up his hand to his brow. "Well," he said, "he brought me a dirty pannikin." At that word, the captain and I and Mr. Riach all looked at each other for a second with a kind of frightened look, and then Hosian walked up to his chief officer, took him by the shoulder, led him across to his bunk, and bade him lie down and go to sleep, as you might speak to a bad child. The murderer cried a little, but he took off his sea boots and obeyed. "Ah," cried Mr. Riach with a dreadful voice, "you should have interfered long sin. It's too late now." "Mr. Riach," said the captain, "this night's work must never be kent in Dysart. The boy went overboard, sir. That's what the story is, and I would give £5 out of my pocket if it was true." He turned to the table. "What make you throw the good bottle away?" he added. "There was nae sense in that, sir. Here, David, draw me another. They're in the bottom locker." And he tossed me a key. "You'll need a glass yourself, sir," he added to Riach. Yon was an ugly thing to see. So the pair sat down and hobnobbed, and while they did so, the murderer, who had been lying and whimpering in his berth, raised himself upon his elbow and looked at them and at me. That was the first night of my new duties, and in the course of the next day I had got well into the run of them. I had to serve at the meals, which the captain took at regular hours, sitting down with the officer who was off duty. All the day through I would be running with a dram to one or other of my three masters, and at night I slept on a blanket thrown on the deck boards at the aftermost end of the roundhouse, and right in the draught of the two doors. It was a hard and a cold bed, nor was I suffered to sleep without interruption, for someone would be always coming in from deck to get a dram, and when a fresh watch was to be set, two, and sometimes all three, would sit down and brew a bowl together. How they kept their health I knew not, any more than how I kept my own. And yet, in other ways, it was an easy service. There was no cloth to lay. The meals were either of oatmeal porridge or salt junk, except twice a week, when there was duff. And though I was clumsy enough, and, not being firm on my sea legs, sometimes fell with what I was bringing them, both Mr. Riach and the captain were singularly patient. I could not but fancy they were making up leeway with their consciences, and that they would scarce have been so good with me if they had not been worse with Ransom. As for Mr. Sean, the drink, or his crime, or the two together, had certainly troubled his mind. I cannot say I ever saw him in his proper wits. He never grew used to me being there, stared at me continually. Sometimes I could have thought, with terror, and more than once drew back from my hand when I was serving him. I was pretty sure from the first that he had no clear mind of what he had done, and on my second day in the roundhouse I had the proof of it. We were alone, and he had been staring at me a long time, when, all at once, up he got, as pale as death, and came close up to me, to my great terror. But I had no cause to be afraid of him. "You were not here before?" he asked. "No, sir," said I. "There was another boy?" he asked again. And when I answered him, "Ah," says he, "I thought that," and went and sat down without another word, except to call for brandy. You may think it strange, but for all the horror I had, I was still sorry for him. He was a married man, with a wife in Leith, but whether or no he had a family, I have now forgotten. I hope not. Altogether it was no very hard life for the time it lasted, which, as you are to hear, was not long. I was as well fed as the best of them. Even their pickles, which were the great dainty, I was allowed my share of, and had I liked, I might have been drunk from morning to night, like Mr. Sean. I had company, too, and good company of its sort. Mr. Riach, who had been to the college, spoke to me like a friend when he was not sulking, and told me many curious things, and some that were informing, and even the captain, though he kept me at the stick's end the most part of the time, would sometimes unbuckle a bit and tell me of the fine countries he had visited. The shadow of poor Ransom, to be sure, lay on all four of us, and on me and Mr. Sean in particular most heavily. And then I had another trouble of my own. Here I was, doing dirty work for three men that I looked down upon, and one of whom, at least, should have hung upon a gallows. That was for the present, and as for the future, I could only see myself slaving alongside of negroes in the tobacco fields. Mr. Riach, perhaps from caution, would never suffer me to say another word about my story. The captain, whom I tried to approach, rebuffed me like a dog, and would not hear a word, and as the days came and went, my heart sank lower and lower, till I was even glad of the work which kept me from thinking. Chapter 9. The Man with the Belt of Gold. More than a week went by, in which the ill luck that had hitherto pursued the Covenant upon this voyage grew yet more strongly marked. Some days she made a little way, others she was driven actually back. At last we were beaten so far to the south that we tossed and tacked to and fro the whole of the 9th day, within sight of Cape Wrath and the wild, rocky coast on either hand of it. There followed on that a council of the officers, and some decision which I did not rightly understand, seeing only the result, that we had made a fair wind of a foul one, and were running south. The 10th afternoon there was a falling swell, and a thick, wet, white fog that hid one end of the brig from the other. All afternoon, when I went on deck, I saw men and officers listening hard over the bulwarks, for breakers, they said, and though I did not so much as understand the word, I felt danger in the air, and was excited. Maybe about 10 at night, I was serving Mr. Rioch and the captain at their supper, when the ship struck something with a great sound, and we heard voices singing out. My two masters leaped to their feet. "She's struck," said Mr. Rioch. "No, sir," said the captain. "We've only run a boat down." And they hurried out. The captain was in the right of it. We had run down a boat in the fog, and she had parted in the midst and gone to the bottom with all her crew but one. This man, as I heard afterwards, had been sitting in the stern as a passenger, while the rest were on the benches rowing. At the moment of the blow, the stern had been thrown into the air, and the man, having his hands free, and for all he was encumbered with a frieze overcoat that came below his knees, had leapt up and caught hold of the brig's bowsprit. It showed he had luck and much agility and unusual strength that he should have thus saved himself from such a pass. And yet, when the captain brought him into the roundhouse, and I set eyes on him for the first time, he looked as cool as I did. He was smallish in stature, but well set and as nimble as a goat. His face was of good open expression, but sunburnt very dark, and heavily freckled and pitted with the smallpox. His eyes were unusually light, and had a kind of dancing madness in them that was both engaging and alarming. And when he took off his greatcoat, he laid a pair of fine silver-mounted pistols on the table, and I saw that he was belted with a great sword. His manners, besides, were elegant, and he pledged the captain handsomely. Altogether I thought of him, at the first sight, that here was a man I would rather call my friend than my enemy. The captain, too, was taking his observations, but rather of the man's clothes than his person. And to be sure, as soon as he had taken off the greatcoat, he showed forth mighty fine for the roundhouse of a merchant brig, having a hat with feathers, a red waistcoat, breeches of black plush, and a blue coat with silver buttons and handsome silver lace, costly clothes, though somewhat spoiled with the fog and being slept in. "I am vexed, sir, about the boat," says the captain. "There are some pretty men gone to the bottom," said the stranger, "that I would rather see on the dry land again than half a score of boats." "Friends of yours," said Hosian. "You have none such friends in your country," was the reply. "They would have died for me like dogs." "Well, sir," said the captain, still watching him, "there are more men in the world than boats to put them in." "And that's true, too," cried the other, "and you seem to be a gentleman of great penetration." "I have been in France, sir," says the captain, so that it was plain he meant more by the words than showed upon the face of them. "Well, sir," said the other, "and so is many a pretty man, for the matter of that." "No doubt, sir," says the captain, "and fine coats." "Oh ho," says the stranger, "is that how the wind sets?" And he laid his hand quickly on his pistols. "Don't be hasty," said the captain. "Don't do him mischief before you see the need of it. You've a French soldier's coat upon your back, and a Scotch tongue in your head, to be sure, but so has many an honest fellow in these days, and I dare say none the worse of it." "So," said the gentleman in the fine coat, "are you of the honest party?" Meaning, was he a Jacobite? For each side in these sort of civil broils takes the name of honesty for its own. "Why, sir," replied the captain, "I am a true-blood Protestant, and I thank God for it." It was the first word of any religion I had heard from him, but I learnt afterward that he was a great churchgoer while on shore. "But, for all that," says he, "I can be sorry to see another man with his back to the wall." That is pretty cool. I like it. "Can you so indeed?" asked the Jacobite. "Well, sir, to be quite plain with you, I am one of those honest gentlemen that were in trouble about the years 45 and 6. And, to be still quite plain with you, if I got into the hands of any of the red-coated gentry, it's like it would go hard with me. Now, sir, I was for France, and there was a French ship cruising here to pick me up, but she gave us the go-by in the fog, as I wished from the heart that ye had done yourself. And the best that I can say is this: if you can set me ashore where I was going, I have that upon me will reward you highly for your trouble." "In France," says the captain. "No, sir, that I cannot do. But where you came from, we might talk of that." And then, unhappily, he observed me standing in my corner, and packed me off to the galley to get supper for the gentlemen. I lost no time, I promise you, and when I came back into the roundhouse, I found the gentleman had taken a money belt from about his waist and poured out a guinea or two upon the table. The captain was looking at the guineas, and then at the belt, and then at the gentleman's face, and I thought he seemed excited. "Half of it," he cried, "and I'm your man." The other swept back the guineas into the belt and put it on again under his waistcoat. "I have told you, sir," said he, "that not one doit of it belongs to me. It belongs to my chieftain," and here he touched his hat, "and while I would be but a silly messenger to grudge some of it that the rest might come safe, I should show myself a hound indeed if I brought my own carcass any too dear. 30 guineas on the seaside, or 60 if you set me on the Lenny Loch. Take it if you will. If not, you can do your worst." "Aye," said Hosian, "and if I give you over to the soldiers?" "You would make a fool's bargain," said the other. "My chief, let me tell you, sir, is forfeited, like every honest man in Scotland. His estate is in the hands of the man they call King George, and it is his officers that collect the rents, or try to collect them. But for the honour of Scotland, the poor tenant bodies take a thought upon their chief lying in exile, and this money is a part of that very rent for which King George is looking. Now, sir, you seem to me to be a man that understands things. Bring this money within the reach of government, and how much of it'll come to you?" "Little enough to be sure," said Hosian, and then, "if they knew," he added dryly. "But I think, if I was to try, that I could hold my tongue about it." "Ah, but I'll beguile you there," cried the gentleman. "Play me false, and I'll play you cunning. If a hand is laid upon me, they shall ken what money it is." "Well," returned the captain, "what must be, must. 60 guineas and done. Here's my hand upon it." "And here's mine," said the other. And thereupon the captain went out, rather hurriedly, I thought, and left me alone in the roundhouse with the stranger. At that period, so soon after the 45, there were many exiled gentlemen coming back at their peril of their lives, either to see their friends or to collect a little money. And as for the Highland chiefs that had been forfeited, it was a common matter of talk how their tenants would stint themselves to send them money, and their clansmen outface the soldiery to get it in, and run the gauntlet of our great navy to carry it across. All this I had, of course, heard tell of, and now I had a man under my eyes whose life was forfeit on all these counts, and upon one more, for he was not only a rebel and a smuggler of rents, but had taken service with the King Louis of France. And, as if all this were not enough, he had a belt full of golden guineas round his loins. Whatever my opinions, I could not look on such a man without a lively interest. "And so you're a Jacobite," said I, as I set meat before him. "Aye," said he, beginning to eat. "And you, by your long face, should be a Whig?" "Betwixt and between," said I, not to annoy him, for indeed I was as good a Whig as Mr. Campbell could make me. "And that's naething," said he. "But I'm saying, Mr. Betwixt and between," he added, "this bottle of yours is dry, and it's hard if I'm to pay 60 guineas and be grudged a dram upon the back of it." "I'll go and ask for the key," said I, and stepped on deck. The fog was as close as ever, but the swell almost down. They had laid the brig to, not knowing precisely where they were, and the wind, what little there was of it, not serving well for their true course. Some of the hands were still hearkening for breakers, but the captain and the 2 officers were in the waist with their heads together. It struck me, I don't know why, that they were after no good, and the first word I heard as I drew softly near more than confirmed me. It was Mr. Riach, crying out as if upon a sudden thought. "Couldn't we wile him out of the roundhouse?" "He is better where he is," returned Hosian. "He hasn't room to use his sword." "Well, that's true," said Riach, "but he's hard to come at." "Hut," said Hosian, "we can get the man in talk, one upon each side, and pin him by the 2 arms. Or, if that'll not hold, sir, we can make a run by both the doors, and get him under head before he has the time to draw." At this hearing, I was seized with both fear and anger at these treacherous, greedy, bloody men that I sailed with. My first mind was to run away. My second was bolder. "Captain," said I, "the gentleman is seeking a dram and the bottle's out. Will you give me the key?" They all started and turned about. "Why, here's our chance to get the firearms," Riak cried. And then to me, "Hark ye, David," he said, "do you ken where the pistols are?" Aye, put in Hojan. "David kens. David's a good lad. You see, David, my man, yon wild Highlandman is a danger to the ship, besides being a rank foe to King George, God bless him." I had never been so bedavided since I came on board, but I said yes, as if all I heard was quite natural. "The trouble is," resumed the captain, "that all our firelocks, great and little, are in the roundhouse under this man's nose, likewise the powder. Now if I, or one of the officers, was to go in and take them, he would fall to thinking. But a lad like you, David, might snap up a horn and a pistol or two without remark. And if you can do it cleverly, I'll bear it in mind when it'll be good for you to have friends, and that's when we come to Carolina." Here Mr. Riak whispered him a little. "Very right, sir," said the captain, and then to myself, "And see here, David, yon man has a belt full of gold, and I give you my word that you shall have your fingers in it." I told him that I would do as he wished, though indeed I had scarce breath to speak with, and upon that he gave me the key of the spirit locker, and I began to go slowly back to the roundhouse. What was I to do? They were dogs and thieves. They had stolen me from my own country. They had killed poor Ransom, and I was to hold the candle to another murder? But then, upon the other hand, there was the fear of death very plain before me. For what could a boy and a man, if they were brave as lions, against a whole ship's company? I was still arguing it back and forth, and getting no clearness, when I came into the roundhouse, and saw the Jacobite eating his supper under the lamp. And at that my mind was made up all in a moment. I have no credit by it. It was by no choice of mine, but as if by compulsion that I walked right up to the table and put my hand on his shoulder. "Do you want to be killed?" said I. He sprang to his feet and looked a question at me as clear as if he had spoken. "Oh," cried I, "they're all murderers here. It's a ship full of them. They've murdered a boy already. Now it's you." Aye, said he, "but they haven't got me yet." Then, looking at me curiously, "Will you stand with me?" "That will I," said I. "I'm no thief, nor yet murderer. I'll stand by you." "Why then," said he, "what's your name?" "David Balfour," said I, and then thinking that a man with so fine a coat must like fine people, I added for the first time, "of Shaw's." It never occurred to him to doubt me, for a Highlander is used to see great gentlefolk in great poverty, but as he had no estate of his own, my words nettled a very childish vanity he had. "My name is Stuart," he said, drawing himself up. "Alan Breck they call me. A king's name is good enough for me, though I bear it plain, and have the name of no farm midden to clap to the hind end of it." And having administered this rebuke, even though it were something of a chief importance, he turned to examine our defenses. The roundhouse was built very strong, to support the breaching of the seas. Of its 5 apertures, only the skylight and the 2 doors were large enough for the passage of a man. The doors, besides, could be drawn close. They were of stout oak, and ran in grooves, and were fitted with hooks to keep them either shut or open as the need arose. The one that was already shut I secured in this fashion, but when I was proceeding to slide to the other, Alan stopped me. "David," said he, "for I cannot bring to mind the name of your landed estate, and so will make so bold as to call you David. That door, being open, is the best part of my defences." "It would be better shut," says I. "Not so, David," says he. "You see, I have but one face, but so long as that door is open and my face to it, the best part of my enemies will be in front of me, where I would wish to find them." Then he gave me from the rack a cutlass, of which there were a few besides the firearms, choosing it with great care, shaking his head and saying that he had never in all his life seen poorer weapons. And next he set me down to the table with a powder horn, a bag of bullets, and all the pistols, which he bade me charge. "And that will be better work, let me tell you," said he, "for a gentleman of decent birth, than scraping plates and racking drams to a wheen tarry sailors." Thereupon he stood up in the midst with his face to the door, and drawing his great sword, made trial of the room he had to wield it. I must stick to the point, he said, shaking his head, and that's a pity too. It doesn't set my genius, which is all for the upper guard. And now, said he, do you keep on charging the pistols, and give heed to me? I told him I would listen closely. My chest was tight, my mouth dry, the light dark to my eyes. The thought of the numbers that were soon to leap in upon us kept my heart in a flutter, and the sea, which I heard washing round the brig, and where I thought my dead body would be cast ere morning, ran in my mind strangely. First of all, said he, how many are against us? I reckoned them up, and such was the hurry of my mind, I had to cast the numbers twice. 15, said I. Allen whistled. Well, said he, that can't be cured. And now follow me. It is my part to keep this door, where I look for the main battle, and that ye have no hand. And mind and din a fire to this side, unless they get me down, for I would rather have 10 foes in front of me than one friend like you cracking pistols at my back. I told him indeed that I was no great shot. And that's very bravely said, he cried, in great admiration of my candor. There's many a pretty gentleman that wouldn't dare to say it. But then, sir, said I, there's the door behind you, which they may perhaps break in. Aye, said he, and that is a part of your work. No sooner the pistol's charged than you must climb up into yon bed, where you're handy at the window, and if they lift hand against the door, you're to shoot. But that's not all. Let's make a bit of a soldier of you, David. What else have ye to guard? There's the skylight, said I. But indeed, Mr. Stewart, I would need to have eyes upon both sides to keep the two of them, for when my face is at the one, my back is to the other. And that's very true, said Allen. But have you no ears to your head? To be sure, cried I must hear the bursting of the glass. Ye have some rudiments of sense, said Allen grimly. All right, and we will pick up the rest on Friday. Yeah, Friday. Sorry for the kind of muffled reading there toward the end. I had to get a throat lozenge. But I'm going to go to bed and rest. This has been a hell of a day. Anyway, I hope you guys are well. I hope you have an excellent morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it happens to be. And I will see you guys tomorrow for Shogun for the subscriber read, and Friday for more of Kidnapped. Have an excellent evening. Good night.